I still remember the exact moment my lawyer went quiet. Not the kind of silence where someone is thinking, but the kind where they already know the answer and are waiting to see if you're ready to hear it. The office smelled like old paper and cheap coffee. My hands were shaking, not because I was scared of the law, but because the law was finally on my side. He slid a document across the desk and said slowly, carefully, "If you file this lien, your parents won't be able to sell, refinance, or touch that house without dealing with you first." I didn't respond. My mind wasn't in that room anymore. It was 20 years back, scrubbing floors before sunrise. It was the sound of dishes clattering while other kids slept. It was my mother's voice saying, "Hurry up, you're too slow." It was my father reminding me, "You live under our roof, you owe us." For 20 years, I believed that sentence. The lawyer mistook my silence for doubt. "I need to be clear," he added. "This will destroy your relationship with them." I almost laughed. What relationship? People imagine family abuse as shouting, hitting, dramatic moments. Mine was quieter. It sounded like keys thrown on a table and someone saying, "Clean the house, guests are coming." It looked like me missing birthdays, exams, opportunities, because someone always needed something done. It felt like being useful but never valued. By the time I was 10, I knew how to cook full meals. By 12, I was managing the household when my parents went out. By 15, relatives joked that I was so responsible, while my parents smiled like proud employers who didn't pay wages. I wasn't their child, I was their system. And systems aren't thanked. They're maintained, exploited, and blamed when they fail. The house everyone admired, the one neighbors complimented, the one relatives boasted about, was built on my unpaid labor. I cleaned it. I maintained it. I contributed money once I started earning. I paid bills I wasn't allowed to question. Every time I asked for freedom, for space, for a life of my own, I was reminded of everything they had given me: food, shelter, shame. The funny thing is, they always spoke about the house like it was sacred. "This is our legacy," my father would say. "One day, all of this will be yours." That promise kept me obedient longer than fear ever could, until the day I learned the truth. The mortgage statements didn't match the money I had been giving them. The numbers didn't lie, even if my parents did. For the first time, I realized something terrifying and liberating at once. They needed me more than I needed them. I looked back at the document on the desk. My name was already typed. All that was missing was my signature. The lawyer waited. I picked up the pen, thinking not of revenge but of sleep, of waking up without orders, of a life where love wasn't measured in chores completed. I signed. And in that moment I knew nothing would ever be the same. I didn't tell them right away. I went home like nothing had changed, stepped into the same house, and slipped back into the same routine as if I hadn't just altered the foundation of their world. That was the strange thing about control, it survives on habit. I had been trained in those habits since childhood. That evening, my mother handed me a list without even looking up from her phone. Groceries, laundry, cleaning the guest room. I took it like I always did. My father sat on the couch watching television, complaining about how tired he was, how hard life had become, how children these days didn't appreciate their parents. I nodded at the right moments. I always knew when to nod. Inside, something was different, not louder, not angrier, quieter. Like a door closing gently instead of being slammed. As I scrubbed the kitchen sink, I remembered being 8 years old, standing on a stool, my arms aching as I washed dishes too big for my hands. I remembered breaking a glass once and crying, not because of the cut on my finger, but because I knew what would come next. Not comfort, not concern, just disappointment. Anger, a lecture about money and carelessness. "Do you think money grows on trees?" my father had asked back then. Years later, I realized the irony. My labor had been their tree. Growing up, I thought this was normal. Other kids complained about homework. I worried about whether the house would be clean enough to avoid shouting. Other teenagers argued about curfews. I argued about whether I was allowed to be tired. Every request I made for time, for privacy, for independence was treated like betrayal. "You're changing," my mother would say. "You're becoming selfish," my father would add. What they meant was, "You're becoming inconvenient." When I started earning, things got worse. My income didn't buy me freedom, it tightened their grip. Suddenly, I was contributing to the family, a phrase that sounded noble but felt like a chain. I paid utilities, I covered repairs, I handed over cash without receipts or explanations. When I asked where the money was going, I was accused of mistrust. "How dare you question us? After everything we've done for you." Guilt is a powerful leash. They pulled it every time. That night after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in my room, the same room I'd grown up in, unchanged, frozen in time. I opened my laptop and looked at the documents I had copied quietly over months. Bank statements, mortgage papers, payment histories, proof. The house wasn't almost paid off like they claimed. It was drowning in debt, and my money, my years, had been keeping it afloat. For the first time, the narrative shifted in my head. I wasn't a burden. I was an asset. And assets, when they realize their value, stop being obedient. I didn't feel triumph. I felt grief. Grief for the child who thought love was earned through exhaustion. Grief for the adult who stayed too long, hoping something would change. Down the hall, I could hear my parents snoring peacefully, unaware that the ground beneath them had already cracked. They still thought they owned everything in that house. They had no idea that soon, the house would finally answer to me. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside an official-looking envelope that my mother almost threw away with the junk mail. I watched her from the doorway as she sorted through the pile, half asleep, still in her robe. For a second I thought fate might be cruel enough to delay things, but then she paused. Something about the paper made her frown. She opened it. Her face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Fear. She called for my father, her voice sharp and confused. He came in irritated, already annoyed that his morning routine was being interrupted. I stayed quiet, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "What is this?" my father asked, scanning the page. "This doesn't make sense," my mother said. "There must be a mistake." They read it again and again. Then my father's eyes lifted slowly and locked onto me. That was the moment everything collapsed. He didn't ask, he accused. "Did this?" he said, like he was stating a fact, not forming a question. The room filled with shouting almost instantly. Words like ungrateful, traitor, selfish were thrown at me like weapons. My mother cried loudly, dramatically, as if the volume of her pain could rewrite history. She talked about sacrifices, about sleepless nights, about giving me life, as if life was a debt I could never repay. Neighbors peeked through curtains. The walls that had swallowed my silence for 20 years suddenly echoed with noise. I stood there, calm in a way that surprised even me. I realized something in that moment. This was the first time they were reacting to me, not commanding me. The power had shifted and they felt it. "You're trying to steal our house," my father yelled. "No," I said quietly. "I'm protecting what I paid for." That sentence stunned them. They laughed at first, mocking, dismissive. My father waved his hand like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You don't own anything here," he said. "This is our house." I looked at the paper in my mother's shaking hands. "Not without dealing with me." Silence. My mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing, calling relatives on her phone before the argument had even ended. By afternoon, my name was being dragged through family group chats. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had never asked how much I worked or how tired I was suddenly had opinions about loyalty and respect. None of them asked why I did it. They only cared that I dared to. My parents tried everything in the following days. Anger turned into bargaining. Bargaining turned into guilt. My mother stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, as if withholding labor was supposed to hurt me. My father warned me about curses, about regret, about dying alone. But the threats didn't land the way they used to. For the first time in my life, their words sounded empty. At night, I lay awake listening to the house, the same house I had kept alive with my hands and my money, and realized something strange. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was done. They still thought this was about punishment, about revenge. They didn't understand yet that this was about escape. And once someone tastes escape, they never go back. After the shouting faded, something worse settled into the house: coldness. Not silence exactly, but a sharp, deliberate distance. My parents stopped speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary, and when they did, every word was heavy with accusation. Plates were slammed onto the table. Doors were closed just a little harder than usual. Even the air felt tense, like the house itself was holding its breath. Relatives started calling me directly. Some pretended to be concerned, their voices soft and careful, asking if I was okay before quickly reminding me of my duties as a child. Others didn't bother pretending. They told me I was heartless, that I was ruining my parents' health, that I would regret this when it was too late. I listened, I always listened. But for the first time, I didn't explain myself, because explaining had never saved me before. At night, memories came in waves. Times I had defended my parents to friends who asked why I never went out. Times I told myself, this is just how families are. Times I believed that if I worked a little harder, complained a little less, love would eventually arrive like a reward. It never did. One evening, my mother finally broke the silence. She sat across from me at the dining table, her eyes red but sharp. "If you remove this, Lien," she said quietly, "we can forget all of this. We can be a family again." Again. The word echoed in my head. Again meant returning to the version of me that didn't sleep, didn't rest, didn't belong to myself. Again meant pretending nothing was broken when it had been cracked from the beginning. I don't want to forget, I said. Her face hardened. So you're choosing money over us. I wanted to tell her how wrong she was, that this wasn't about money or property or winning, that this was about being seen as human instead of useful. But I knew it wouldn't matter. To her, my worth had always been tied to what I provided. That night my father packed a small bag and left the house, telling anyone who would listen that he was too stressed to stay. It was meant to scare me, to make me feel responsible, to pull me back into line. Instead, I noticed how quiet the house became without him, how peaceful. Days passed, then weeks. The legal process moved slowly but steadily, indifferent to emotions or family drama. Every letter that arrived reminded my parents that this wasn't something they could shout away. They started whispering instead, planning, worrying, calculating. I watched them age in real time, and in a strange way I felt lighter. I began spending more time outside the house, long walks, quiet cafes, places where no one knew me as the helpful one. Each step away felt like stealing back pieces of myself I hadn't realized were missing. One night, as I lay in bed, I understood something that changed everything. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing this because staying had been slowly destroying me. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't waiting for permission. I was preparing to leave. The decision to leave didn't happen all at once. It formed quietly in the spaces where fear used to live. I started noticing how often my hands shook for no reason, how my body stayed tense even when nothing was happening. Trauma doesn't announce itself. It just waits until you finally stop running. My parents noticed the changes too. I stopped responding immediately when my name was called. I stopped jumping up to fix things that weren't my responsibility. When my mother complained about the house being messy, I nodded, but I didn't move. That alone felt rebellious. "You're acting strange," she said one afternoon, watching me carefully. "I'm tired," I replied. That used to be a dangerous word. Tired meant lazy. Tired meant ungrateful. This time she didn't argue. She just looked confused, like a machine malfunctioning when its usual command no longer worked. Behind the scenes, my parents were scrambling. I overheard whispered conversations about selling the house, about asking relatives for money, about how unfair I had been. They spoke as if I wasn't there, as if I was already gone. Maybe I had been, long before I realized it. One evening, my father returned. He sat me down like I was still a child and explained, slowly, patiently, how much stress I was causing the family. He talked about his health, his reputation, what people were saying. Not once did he ask how I was. "I raised you better than this," he said. Something inside me finally snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a rope cutting free. "You raised me to serve," I said, "not to live." His face went blank. For the first time, he had nothing to say. That night, I packed a bag. Not everything, just enough. Clothes, documents, the essentials of a life I was finally choosing. I hid the bag in my car and went back inside, moving through the house like a ghost. Every wall held memories. Every room carried exhaustion. This place had shaped me, but it no longer owned me. The next morning, I left early. No announcement. No goodbye speech. I sent one message, short, factual, letting them know I had moved out and that all communication should go through my lawyer. My phone exploded within minutes. Calls, messages, voice notes filled with rage and panic. I didn't respond. Sitting alone in my new space, a small, quiet room that was entirely mine, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not happiness. Not yet, relief. The Lien was still in place. The house was still legally tangled. My parents were still furious. But for the first time, none of that was happening inside me. I slept without listening for footsteps. I woke up without a list of chores waiting for me. I ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, and realized how little I had ever been allowed to feel those things. I knew the fallout wasn't over. There would be more calls, more accusations, more attempts to pull me back. Also knew this. Even if everything else fell apart, I would never return to being unpaid labor disguised as love. I had chosen myself, and that choice once made could never be taken away. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, almost suspiciously, like something I didn't trust yet. In the first few days after moving out, I kept waiting for the guilt to crush me, for panic to drag me back. That's what had always happened before. This time, the silence stayed gentle. My parents didn't accept it. They escalated. My mother started calling late at night, her voice trembling, telling me she couldn't sleep, that the stress was killing her. She reminded me of my childhood illnesses, the nights she stayed awake, the sacrifices she made. Each memory was presented like a receipt, proof that I owed her my life in installments. My father tried a different tactic. He left voice messages warning me about consequences, legal ones, emotional ones, spiritual ones. He said the Lien made me look greedy. He said people were talking. He said no one would trust someone who could do this to their own parents. For a moment, the old fear crept back in. The instinct to fix things, to apologize, to return and smooth everything over with effort and obedience. But then I remembered how tired I had been. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from erasing yourself day after day. I didn't go back. Weeks passed. The lawyer updated me regularly. My parents had tried to remove the lien. They couldn't. They had tried to refinance the house quietly. They couldn't. Every path led back to me. For the first time, they were forced to acknowledge my existence as more than background labor. They asked to meet. I agreed, but only with conditions. Public place. Lawyer aware, clear boundaries. We sat across from each other like strangers pretending to be family. My mother cried. My father stared at the table. They said they were hurt. They said they felt betrayed. They said they never meant for things to go this far. I listened. Then I asked a single question. If I remove the lien, what changes? They looked at each other, hesitated. My father finally spoke. Things can go back to normal. Normal, that was my answer. I stood up without raising my voice. Normal is what broke me. The meeting ended there. After that, something shifted permanently. They stopped trying to negotiate emotionally and started trying to survive practically. They sold things. They borrowed money. They adjusted just like I had always been expected to. And I realized something important: they were capable of adapting all along. They just didn't want to as long as I was there to absorb the pressure. In my new life, small things became victories: choosing what to eat, saying no without explaining, sitting still without being accused of laziness. I started therapy. I learned words for what I had lived through: enmeshment, parentification, financial abuse. Naming it didn't erase the past, but it gave me permission to stop blaming myself for it. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the house, about the rooms I had cleaned 1,000 times, about the child who believed love meant service. I didn't feel hatred anymore. I felt distance. The lien wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was a boundary written in legal language because emotional boundaries had never been respected. For 20 years, I had been invisible unless I was useful. Now, even in their anger, they had to see me. And that was something they could never undo. Time did what arguments never could. It created space. Months passed, and the constant noise from my parents faded into occasional messages, shorter, less dramatic, stripped of their old power. The anger burned itself out, leaving behind something quieter and more honest: consequences. They learned how to manage the house without me. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but they managed. The world didn't end because I stopped holding everything together. That realization was both relieving and painful. Relieving because it proved I was never truly needed the way they claimed. Painful because it meant my suffering had always been optional to them. I started noticing changes in myself that felt almost foreign. I laughed more easily. I slept deeper. My body stopped bracing for impact every time my phone buzzed. Even my posture changed, like I was finally allowed to take up space without apology. One afternoon, I received a message from my mother that didn't ask for anything. It simply said, "We're struggling." I stared at the screen for a long time. The old version of me would have rushed back, offered solutions, sacrificed again. That version had been trained to treat other people's discomfort as an emergency. This time I replied honestly, "I'm sorry you're struggling, I can't fix it for you." There was no response. I didn't feel cruel, I felt clear. The Lien eventually forced a resolution. They negotiated. Terms were set. Money was acknowledged mine, not as a favor, not as gratitude, as fact. Seeing my contributions recognized in legal documents felt surreal, like watching reality correct a lie I had lived inside for decades. When it was over, truly over, I expected some grand emotional release. Closure, satisfaction, justice. What I felt instead was quiet acceptance. My parents and I were no longer pretending. They no longer saw me as an extension of themselves. I no longer saw them as authority figures whose approval I needed to survive. Whatever remained between us was distant, fragile, and real in a way it had never been before. I visited the house one last time, not to clean, not to help, but to collect a few things I had left behind. Standing there, I realized how small it felt, how heavy, how much of my life had been compressed inside those walls. I didn't hate them. I also didn't excuse them. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. They end with separation, and that has to be enough. As I drove away, I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who believed endurance was the same thing as love. I wished I could tell them what I know now, that survival is not a debt and freedom is not betrayal. Placing that lien didn't make me heartless, it made me honest. And honesty, for the first time in my life, felt like home. People still ask me if I regret it. They ask in careful voices like they're handling something fragile. Do you ever feel bad? Do you think you went too far? They're still your parents after all. I used to rehearse answers in my head, long explanations, justifications, proof that I wasn't a monster. Now I just tell the truth. I regret waiting 20 years. I regret believing that love had to hurt to be real. I regret confusing obedience with loyalty and exhaustion with virtue. I regret how small I learned to make myself so others could feel large. But I don't regret the lien. Because what most people never understand is this: the lien wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was the end of denial. The house was just the symbol. The real issue was ownership of my time, my body, my future. For years, my parents acted like they owned all three. That piece of paper was the first thing that ever told them they didn't. I didn't win anything glamorous. I didn't walk away rich or celebrated. What I gained was quieter and far more valuable. I gained mornings without dread. Evenings without orders. A sense of self that didn't collapse the moment someone was disappointed in me. I learned how to rest without guilt, how to say no without apologizing, how to sit in silence and not feel like I was doing something wrong. Sometimes, late at night, the old thoughts still try to come back. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe I should have been more patient. Maybe good children don't do what I did. When that happens, I remind myself of something simple. Good parents don't take 20 years of unpaid labor from their child and call it love. I didn't place a lien because I hated my parents. I placed it because I finally loved myself enough to stop disappearing. Because I understood that boundaries don't make you cruel, they make you safe. And because no one was coming to save me but me. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in my story, if you're the one holding everything together, paying emotional and physical debts that never seem to decrease, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for wanting a life. You are not ungrateful for refusing to be used. And you are not wrong for choosing freedom over familiarity. Family should not feel like a prison you have to earn your way out of. I didn't burn the house down. I didn't destroy my parents. I simply stopped sacrificing myself to keep their world comfortable. And when I walked away, lighter than I had ever been, I realized something that still makes me breathe easier every day. I didn't take anything from them. I took myself back.